The Toronto Maple Leafs are looking for that breakthrough postseason. Is this the year? David Morassutti of Locked On Leafs joined us to discuss what the team has to do and their season outlook next on the Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts, so you can get new episodes as soon as they drop. You can also hear us on SiriusXM on the SXM app. Just do a search for Locked On NHL. The Toronto Maple Leafs have come so close. They're still looking for that elusive first Stanley Cup since the original six era. David Morassutti is here to talk about all things Leafs as the season gets closer. And David, talk to me about the way this team has looked in the preseason. What are the good aspects that you've seen and what are your concerns?
Well, I mean, if you're looking at just preseason in general, there was a lot of talk about the move of William Nylander going to center, how that was all going to turn out. And I think the big one right now that has been the biggest, I wouldn't call it problem per se, because in a way it shouldn't be viewed as a problem, but there are a lot of players that are putting themselves in position to earn jobs. The problem is the Leafs don't exactly they aren't flush with cap space to say, yeah, we can have every guy on the team that we want. There was always this feeling that the Leafs were going to have to make some tough decisions just to make themselves cap compliant. Now, injuries might help in that regard of helping the team remain cap compliant, but it's very tough when you have a player who's having a breakout camp. I'm putting like a Nick Robertson out there. Connor Timmins has looked really good in camp and in preseason games. And you're like, oh, it'd be great if these guys can make the roster. And it's like, well, can't exactly put everybody on the roster because they just don't have the cap room to put. They might not even be able to have a full 23-man roster, right? Like that's the position they find themselves in. Now, of course, there's a few injuries that are going to have to be sorted out. And that in itself has brought up upon another problem of depth, right? If these injuries are ones that you can go on LTIR and maybe you can get some salary cap space, but it's the players that are getting hurt. John Klingberg is dealing with something. We're not too sure the full extent of that. Connor Timmins, who I mentioned, he hurt himself in the last preseason game, and he's going to miss some time, which usually means significant time. So that, in a way, helps with the cap problem, but it also takes away a guy who is supposed to be coming in as one of your top depth guys that you're going to call back in. So that's another thing is the depth there on defense is going to be tested a lot, and it was already a decor that people were having issues with or feeling iffy about because they didn't really make many changes. They only brought in John Klingberg, and that was the only change they made from this blue line. Yeah, Jake McCabe was brought in the trade deadline. He had a contract passed last year, so he's technically a new addition, but not new because he played here after the trade deadline. So there's still a lot of things that are going to be sorted out. There are some positives though, but when you're looking at kind of the issues that the Leafs are dealing with, those are, I think, the prevalent ones.
So how do they get cap compliant? What would be the most logical move or the best moves they could make to free up some cap space, get some of those up-and-coming players into the lineup and still field a contending team?
Yeah, I mean, the only way you can really do it is if there's a player on the team that's making, half-decent salary that is on the bubble of making the roster. He's likely going to have to go on waivers. And if there's a player that's playing better than them and earning a job, there are some players that are certainly playing well that should be getting jobs that are likely not going to be getting jobs. Pontus Holmberg is one of them. I mentioned Nick Robertson's another one that he had a really good game in their last preseason game, but his spot on the roster is not secured. So the only way the Leafs can get themselves cap compliant, if everybody's healthy and ready to go, is you'd have to go with a very minimal roster, right? Like no bench. You might even have to go with 20 guys they were talking about. But I think with the injury to Timmins, he's one of those guys that's making just over $1 million. That's going to help free up some space there. We already know what they're doing with Matt Murray and Matt Murray's contract and Jake Muzzin's contract. That gives them some LTIR relief, but unfortunately, they're just going to have to go with the minimal roster that they can. But then, you've got a guy like Matthew Nice who's making, rookie salary that's going to be able to step in and play a big role. And actually, the other player that could be an X factor here is Cal Yarncroke. He hasn't been able to really do much. He's been dealing with injury as well. If it's a long-term thing, that frees up $2.1 million. Some people are saying maybe you go and you try to trade a Cal Yarncroke because his salary is so inflated, and in comparison to what the other guys are, then maybe you go out and you make a trade with him and you feel comfortable in the guys behind him to be able to step in and do what he's doing.
Talk to me a little bit about the goaltending. How do you see the playing time being distributed, and what kind of roles do you expect each goalie to have?
Yeah, I mean, Ilya Samsonov is the undoubted starter. He finally played in his first preseason game against Montreal. And look, that was it was by design, I think. They knew what they had with Ilya Samsonov. He was no doubt the starter. They want to see the other guys. The question some were having was the backup job. Is it Joseph Wols? I think it still is, because he needs to go on waivers, and he's the one that's signed for the future. He's the only goalie signed past the season for the Leafs. I don't see them giving up on Joseph Woll this early. He looked really good in the playoffs. He had a okay start to preseason, albeit preseason it's tough to really judge a goaltender sometimes, especially with the team playing in front of him. Martin Jones was brought in to be kind of the third goaltender / kind of battle with Jones for the backup, battle with Wolf for the backup job. Issue with Martin Jones is he's one of those where I feel like if they could have the cap space to have a third goalie, they'd love to have Martin Jones on the roster. The problem is they don't have the luxury to have a third goalie on the roster because of salary cap reasons. So he's likely going to be either on waivers, or if a team is in need of a goaltender. There are a few. I don't know if they would really want to trade Martin Jones within the division to Tampa, but I do think that you're seeing a lot of goalies being placed on waivers, and actually quite a few goalies being picked up because of injuries. Teams want to go with some more veteran options. I don't know if I see Martin Jones sticking around that much longer. And unfortunately, the Leafs don't have a lot of experience in the minors, guys with NHL experience. So that's why they also brought in Martin Jones, is then if they need a third goaltender, they at least have one with some NHL experience. Now, look, the Leafs can be as strategic as possible, try to sneak Martin Jones in through waivers. I don't know if that's going to be possible because Martin Jones played a lot of NHL games last year, and he won quite a few NHL games last year. Numbers weren't amazing, but teams value that. Teams want NHL bodies, so he's going to probably be the most in demand if the Leafs do put him on waivers.
Let's get back to Michael Nylander. Talk to me about how the position switch is going and how he's looked.
Yeah, I mean, with Nylander, I think there was always belief he could be a center, right? There was always the belief that he can do it, at least from Sheldon Keefe's perspective, because when Sheldon Keefe was the coach of the Marlies and Nylander was there, Nylander played center for him. So the coach knows he can do it because he's seen him do it. The thing is, at the NHL level, it's a totally different animal. But what the Leafs can do with Nylander that they couldn't do in the past, or they hadn't really tried in the past, was having him as the third line center. And their depth right now, what they have done on the wings, has allowed them to be in a position where they can have a good third line. Max Domi can be a third line scoring winger for this team, and that's something they hadn't really had the luxury of in the past, right? They've got some depth that they can move guys around on the wings. And I think actually what the William Nylander move to center does is, certain players actually get the ability now to play in the top six that maybe you'd like to see, but because you've already had Nylander in a top six role, you couldn't get him there. So the Leafs, I know they really want, I think they saw the value of having three really good centers, three good lines, rather than here's our top six. Our bottom six is quite the drop off in talent. I don't think they want to do that anymore. I think they realized, let's make teams actually have to respect our bottom six a little bit more. I think that's been the biggest change, and that's what the change of putting William Nylander at center does for them.
All right, David, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Yeah, you can follow the podcast wherever you get your podcast from. Locked On Leafs. Make sure you go and subscribe to us on YouTube. We're on the road to 5,000, so we're close. We're about 900 away. We're gonna keep pushing towards it. So you can go and subscribe to our YouTube channel there. Follow myself on the X platform, formerly known as Twitter, at @D_Morassutti.
All right, David, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Gil.
Today's episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers.